Okay, hear me out. Here's my argument. Some refer to the period between the fall of Western Rome in 476 and the beginning of the medieval period as the Dark Ages. And some will extend that designation through the medieval period until the beginning of the Renaissance, when Western Europe woke up and experienced a cultural rebirth as they reconnected with Greek and Roman cultural identities and humanist individualism. The term Dark Ages implies that Western Europe experienced a cultural and intellectual decline in those in-between years. But that's just not universally true. So let's look at where the term Dark Ages came from and why modern historians are reluctant to use that phrase. So my plan today is to dismantle some arguments that promote the concept of a Dark Ages in Europe. I would love to hear your thoughts, because discussions and debates are crucial parts of doing history. So let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree or have other ideas or anything else. So first, I suppose we should talk about when the term Dark Ages was first used. Then, let's contextualize it. So basically, who came up with it and why? Why that person in that place in that moment in time? We typically credit the idea to Francesco Petrarch, an Italian poet and humanist who lived in the 14th century. Humanism was an intellectual movement that began in the late 14th century based on a renewed interest in the classical world and increased emphasis on our humanity and our own agency and free will. It was a response to the medieval church's presumption over the divine over the self, that human agency is not as important as religious authority. And as a humanist, Petrarch idealized and promoted ancient Greek and Roman texts. He believed that these texts, perhaps from his perspective works from the golden age of Europe, gave insights into human nature and the self, more than religious works could. It is important to note, though, that Petrarch was still a very religious man. He did not denounce the church or his faith, only promoted human agency alongside it. Now, according to medieval historians Matthew Gabriel and David Perry in their book, I've got that around here somewhere, here it is. In their book, The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe, quote, Petrarch lamented the intellectual milieu of art and thought that had preceded him, saying that they were cloaked in darkness and dense gloom. They were Dark Ages. He characterized the classical past as an era of pure radiance. Petrarch and his contemporaries argued that the knowledge of antiquity had been lost for 1,000 years and now was recovered, reborn, translated into their 14th and 15th century Italy. End quote. And because of Petrarch and other humanists like him, we see a transition into what we now call the Renaissance, the rebirth of art and culture, a reclaiming of ancient Greek and Roman art and ideals, and because of that, we have a distinct turning point in history, when we depart the darkness of the medieval world in favor of the Renaissance, the beginning of the early modern period. Okay, so let's dig deeper then. Why that moment in time? Why Petrarch? Why the late 14th century? There has to be context that explains why men like Petrarch started to change their thinking and push humanist ideals, right? Well, for that, we can look to the world Petrarch lived in, the tumultuous 14th century. Now, when I say Europe in the 1300s, hopefully you're like me and your brain goes straight to the Black Death. And of course, that was a watershed moment in history. When you're living through abject chaos, death literally around every corner, the complete and utter breakdown of society as you know it, yeah, things are likely to change. But there was more to the 14th century than just the plague, and because we're talking about Francesco Petrarch here, let's focus on Italy. Italy in the 14th century wasn't a unified country. In fact, it didn't officially unify until 1861. Italy, instead, was actually a series of city-states like Milan, Venice, Florence, Siena, Genoa. There were a bunch. And the city-states, as you might imagine, were constantly warring with each other over land and power, specifically in this period of time, Milan, Florence, and Venice. Powerful families controlled these city-states. You've got the Viscontis in Milan, the Medicis in Florence, and you can imagine that living in a climate of political conflict and chaos would certainly impact the way Petrarch saw his world. Or, as Matthew Gabriel and David Perry wrote in The Bright Ages, quote, "What is clear is that people in the 14th and 15th century Italy, frustrated with the political chaos and warfare of their ugly era, decided to draw nostalgic links to the worlds of ancient Rome and Greece, using the distant past to sever their connection to the previous 1,000 years of history." End quote. Fair enough. I can see why they did that and why they saw their own period as dark compared to the brightness and nostalgic brilliance of the ancient Greek and Roman world. But does Petrarch's Italian 14th century perspective mean that the entirety of European history, from the fall of Western Rome to the emergence of the Renaissance, was dark? That doesn't feel like a fair and all-encompassing opinion. One man's experience does not and should not define an entire 1,000-year period of history. Okay then, so let's take a look at some other arguments that define this period as the Dark Ages. First, maybe let's start with the beginning of the Dark Ages, the fall of Western Rome. Now, you might have noticed I've been really careful and specific here about saying the fall of Western Rome, and that's because, prior to its typically recorded end in 476, Rome split into two. Here's a brief summary. Hundreds of years into Rome's tenure as empire, its emperors were having an increasingly hard time governing. It was growing too large for one man to control effectively. There were problems associated with this. The military would be spread too thin, leading to an over-reliance on mercenaries, which is not a solid plan for running your civilization. The further away settlements were from Rome, the harder it would be to communicate and engage in trade. And also, with a large empire, you are more exposed to raids and attacks from outsiders, which is inevitably what happened to Rome in the 400s. So Emperor Diocletian decided to split or divide. I always used to say, to help my kids remember it, Diocletian divide. He decided to divide the empire in 286. It went back and forth a few times, unifying as one unit, splitting back into two, until finally, permanently, it split into Eastern and Western Rome in 395 after the death of Theodosius I. The West had its capital at Rome, the East its capital at Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire eventually fell after a series of attacks and invasions from several tribes, like the Goths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, and a whole bunch of others. And for many, the fall of Western Rome meant the end of the classical era and the beginning of the Dark Ages. But Eastern Rome didn't fall until 1453, when Mehmed II conquered Constantinople with his Ottoman Turks. But in school, you probably didn't learn about this empire as the Eastern Roman Empire. You likely learned about it as the Byzantine Empire. And there's a reason for this. It was a way of distinguishing the more Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian half centered around Byzantium from the Latin-speaking Catholic half centered around Rome. Or, as some might simply put it, you can't call it the Roman Empire if there's no Rome. Now, I disagree with that statement personally, but I've heard it said that way. What was left of the Roman Empire was centered around Byzantium, the city. So at some point, after it fell by the way, historians labeled it the Byzantine Empire to distinguish it. But those living in the Byzantine Empire didn't call it that. Today, they were Romans. They called themselves Romans, and they lived in the Roman Empire. It just happened to be the eastern part of it. So to say that the Dark Ages began when Rome fell doesn't really work, because depending on who you're talking to, Rome didn't fall in 476. It lived on through the Byzantines until well after the Renaissance began. Okay then, let's look at another argument. The intellectual decline often attributed to the Dark Ages. A lot of us learned in school that during the Dark Ages we went backwards, right? But what does that even mean? What did they think was backwards about it? Well, again, it depends on who you're talking to. For prominent scholars like English historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote the massively influential tome, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he wrote that in the late 18th century, by the way, it was Christianity that led to the fall of Rome. He argued that in trying to distance itself from its pagan past, the Catholics of Rome were actually responsible for their own fall. It is not an argument that most modern historians agree with, okay? I'm just putting it out there. But it was certainly influential for the time. And once again, we have to consider the context. Gibbon was living and writing through the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions. I believe it was first published, at least the first part of that book was published in 1776, the American Revolution. And these things no doubt influenced his ideas on religion and civilization and the role of governments in their own downfall. But back to the point, did all learning really stop? Did advancements end with the fall of Western Rome and the rise of Catholicism? Did we stop inventing and growing until the Renaissance? No, of course not. Some who argue in favor of being the Dark Ages point to literacy rates, which were lower in this period than in later periods or even during the Roman Empire. And we also have fewer records from this period of time, which helped perpetuate the myth of it being a Dark Age. The argument being that if there are fewer records, then not a lot must have happened. But a decline in record keeping is not the same as a decline in the overall culture because there were advancements in this period. Sure, the political structure changed. The most powerful force became the Catholic Church instead of the Roman Empire. It was more decentralized, with feudal kings, at least a little bit later on when feudalism comes into play, with kings ruling over their territories instead of a single, strong emperor. But just because it didn't look exactly like Rome doesn't mean there wasn't advancement or that it went backwards. Of the many examples I could choose from, perhaps Charlemagne is the best. Charlemagne reigned from 768 to 814, and his empire, the Carolingian Empire, encompassed France and parts of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, he was the first Holy Roman emperor, and he was crowned in 800. And as part of his illustrious tenure as an emperor who united a good chunk of continental Western Europe, he promoted literacy and culture in a time later coins the Carolingian Renaissance, which doesn't sound like the Dark Ages to me. He was a patron of the arts and education. He instituted a standardized script, which was later refined during the Italian Renaissance into present-day Roman script, the alphabet we write. He built churches and chapels and required his clergy to be well educated. He was initially illiterate, but he taught himself to read Greek and Latin, and likely could write it, though not perfectly, he certainly didn't master it. But he was really serious in promoting literacy and learning. And with all of this cultural growth and patronage, the Carolingian Empire attracted scholars from around Europe like Alcuin of York. So, to make the blanket statement that Western European culture declined and went dark in the years between the fall of Western Rome and the Renaissance, or perhaps the fall of Western Rome in the Middle Ages even, is just factually incorrect. And in terms of technological and scientific advancements, they were both still happening, both in Western Europe and outside of it, and there are so many examples. But in the Islamic world, for example, there were massive advancements in math and science, some built on Latin and Greek texts. Within Western Europe, agricultural technology was fast improvement. There were huge growths in technology and engineering in the Americas, which had not yet been connected with Afro-Eurasia by trade, over in Asia. So why then does this myth about a dark age endure to the present, when we know so much more about the time, enough to know that it was not a period where everything went backwards? In another AFOUT mini I did on Iron Maidens and how they weren't real torture devices in the medieval period, I mentioned that in an attempt to separate the modern industrial world of the 19th century from the brutal medieval world of the past, the Iron Maiden was invented in the early 1800s to help demonstrate a stark difference in times, much like how Petrarch did culturally with his writings on humanism, demonstrating a clear difference between the glory days of ancient Greece and Rome and the chaotic, dark, unenlightened years after Western Rome fell. In his writings, Petrarch noted that, quote, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius. No less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom. After the darkness has been dispelled, our grandsons will be able to walk back into the pure radiance of the past." End quote. Petrarch viewed the period of time from the fall of Western Rome to his time, which would later be coined the Renaissance, as an age of darkness. And perhaps in the years to come, Europe could reclaim the glory that was antiquity. But that phrase, the Dark Ages, stuck. And despite it no longer being factually accurate, it still hangs around, and I disagree with it. I like what historian Dennis Hay said about it in 1977. The lively centuries which we call dark. That's a really nice way of putting it. And more recently, in 2020, I read an article from historians John Blair, Stephen Rippon, and Christopher Smart, and they noted that, quote, "The days when archaeologists and historians refer to the 5th to 10th centuries as the Dark Ages are long gone, and the material culture produced during that period demonstrates a high degree of sophistication." End quote. And there are so many more examples, so let me know in the comments what you've learned and what other examples you can think of, or if you disagree with me, that's fine too. Because in reality, at least in my opinion, the Dark Ages weren't so dark. And as we learn more about the past, we also need to re-examine the ways that we describe it. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this AFOUT mini on the Dark Ages. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis, or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.